going to go ahead and start recording this, and wanted to talk today settlement statements. And I have four different ideas, and I had to make no copies for you because we can do Zoom now. So let me share my screen. So this first one, oh boy, I blacked this out and you can still read some of it, but I was trying to hide the names, but I did the best I could. So this first one I have, oh, I didn't want to do that one first. Hold on. No, I do. Okay. So this one is a cash purchase, and settlement statements you're going to get a few days before closing. And is it appropriate to go over them? Yes, I think it's very appropriate. And the best scenario to my customers is when I went over this thoroughly so that I knew I answered everybody's questions. If you're closing in person, you get to the closing table, and my favorite closer in the world was somebody that went over the settlement statement line by line with everybody. And she would turn to my clients and say, have you gone over this with Heather? Or have you seen this yet? That's how she'd put it. Have you seen this yet? And the best scenario is for them to say, oh yeah, we went over it. And Terry would say, okay. And I'd say, could you still go over it with them and make sure they have no questions? So then you felt like doubly they had nothing that they would have questions about. And then they go ahead and sign it in a minute without having to stop the closing. And well, what does this mean? And what does this mean? So I think it's always helpful to have someone go over it. So I chose this particular settlement statement because it's in Copperhead Camp. And this was a cash closing, meaning no loan. So there's a lot less things on the purchaser's settlement statement. Just know as an agent, no matter what side you're on, you want to check both sides, right? And the other side, you're just checking for a few things. I just want to make sure that credit went there. I just want to make sure that, but first off, you just look at it and you say, okay, so sales price, is that correct? Do you have the settlement date? I don't know why they would mess that up, but do you have the closing date correct? The sales price, how could that, can anybody think of a reason that the sales price would be wrong?
Maybe, oh, am I on mute?
Nope, I got you.
Oh, no, I'm not on mute. Sorry. Maybe if you've had a reduction in sales price to make up for something from inspection and that document didn't get over to the title company or
That's it. That's it. So missing AE. Every time you have an amend extend or an inspection resolution, it automatically goes to two people. So one of them's the title company. Who's the other person that needs to see it?
The other agent?
Oh, that too, but they would know about it, the lender, right?
Oh, the lender, yeah.
That's the other person that can get lost. And believe me, it happens to everybody where you're like, oh my gosh, I forgot to send that one piece of paper to the lender. So they put all their documents into the title company, and it shows, instead of the 490, it shows 492. And then the title company is going, well, what about that? And so now you got to kind of start the paperwork process over. So that's why you have to check the sales price. And then earnest money, I've never had one be incorrect. I guess if you had two different earnest money, sometimes you have, like, let's say it's a brand new property, brand new house. You might, as the construction's going on, give this much earnest money at this time, and then you're going to give a little bit more earnest money in a few weeks or in a couple months. So I would just check that, yes, that's what my contract says, it's $5,000. I feel like people are human, and even though it's being entered by a professional, they could make a mistake. So yes, I've never seen a mistake, but go ahead and just check that. And these are just cursory, like you're probably going to remember, oh, it was $5,000. Yeah, no problem. But just pull out your contract. I don't ever need to pull out my contract until I get the settlement statements after I go under contract, because I have all sorts of reminders, and I have my CTME calendar, and I have all these other things. So I don't usually have to pull it out and say, what did I do? And what did I say? I have notes for everything, but I do pull them all out right before closing when I get the settlement statements, just to make sure everything's on there. And if you keep a good file, then it's easy to do. So tax certificate. So the buyer pays for the tax certificate to make sure that they understand what the taxes are on the property. And then, as you know, the seller pays for the title insurance almost always. And if there had been a loan, there'd be one more charge on here for the title commitment for the lender. So the seller pays for the title of the property, the title commitment for the entire property, basically an insurance that you're, as a buyer, going to get clear title to a property when you purchase it. So the seller pays for that to prove that it's good title. And then the buyer has to pay to insure the lender just for as much as they're getting a loan for. So let's say out of 490, they get a loan for 200,000. The buyer would then therefore have on their settlement statement a charge for the title insurance for just the $290,000 worth of title insurance. But it's not on here because it's cash, so it makes it super easy. And even if you have land, oh my God, you have like 3 items on the settlement statement and you think, is there a mistake here? And it's because it just, there isn't much there, especially if it's not in something like maybe Edgemont Highlands is a good example. So closing fees, that's, this 175 was that amount that you split buyer and seller generally for the closing company to process the paperwork. And then the buyer pays for the warranty deed and the doc fee. Do I check these? I don't know. I mean, I don't really, the closing fee, yeah, I make sure it's at 175 and it's not $350 because somebody messed up there. The doc fee, do you notice that's $49 and the price is $490,000? So that's immediately related to, it's like 1/1000th cent or something like that. So it's going to always be the same kind of just in a smaller number as the sales price. So then this is where you just have to be aware. You know, all those boxes in the contract where you're saying, oh, I'm going to split all the costs. If there's any fees to the association, if there's any fee for a status letter, if there's any fee for this, let's just split them all. I got in the way of always putting seller should pay for. And the reason is that as a buyer's agent, especially when you're new, you don't know all the different HOAs and whether they charge for a transfer fee and what that fee might cost. And here's a great example. If you're buying in Copperhead, you have the Copperhead Camp Owners Association, which is underneath the Edgemont Highlands Community Owners Association. And then on top of that, you have a metro district. So there's just a whole lot of things, and you don't want to be surprised at this later on in this. Now, there's also, yeah, so the HOA on these does charge a transfer fee. And I don't know if it was after this or before this. I know in some places where you have one HOA and then you have another HOA for the same property, that if like AREM is the perfect example, they at least used to, when I was selling, charge a fee for transferring ownership to the other person to like make the name changes and everything. So they would charge that fee for both associations, right? So you're getting kind of double charged there. And that's just why I always put it on the seller to pay, because the last thing I need is the buyer the day before closing going, you didn't tell me there were 3 HOAs or 2 HOAs, and then I got to do this. I just don't want my buyer getting upset because I didn't know all the ins and outs of it, and maybe the listing agent didn't know all the ins and outs in it. So I just always made them a seller's cost. But here's an example of just where it can get a little complicated. And then you're always going to have that, if you're taking over something in an HOA, you're going to have a proration for what the owners association dues are, the same way as if you were in the city, you're going to have city services. So the trash, water, sewer is all prorated also at closing. Anything that you're taking over gets prorated at closing, or it should be if you're doing the contract right. The things that wouldn't get prorated would be, let's say, I noticed that sometimes in new agent contracts, you'll put electric shall be prorated. And obviously, what do you do when you sell a property? You turn off your account and someone else has a new account. You don't like transfer that. So you transfer water, sewer, trash. Oh, it looks like I got somebody waiting. Oh, nope, it's a chat. Oh, yeah, see you later, Blair. Okay, you would transfer water, sewer, and trash would get transferred on here. If it's propane, you probably would, yes, you would be prorating those sort of things, but there's other things that you terminate, like a phone bill. You know, in the old days when people actually had landlines, you would terminate that. Anyway, it's a little complicated, so you just kind of look at it and see if it's correct. I'm more worried about this when I'm on the seller side, because on our checklist on the seller side, I have something that you ask the sellers about 14 days before closing. Hey, if you get a bill in the mail, will you just call me before you pay it? Because once in a while you get a seller who gets really upset that they paid a bill and now it's on the settlement statement that they have to pay again because it didn't get to, like they filled out the bill, they mailed it, and it didn't get to wherever it was before the title company made the settlement statement. So now they're having to pay it again and get rebated later. most people don't care. But once in a while you get a seller that's like, well, I paid that yesterday. And you're like, well, it didn't get to where it was supposed to go. So you just have to pay it again. We'll all make it right after closing. Just go ahead and pay it. And most people don't care, but once in a while you do. And then on top of that, you have people that do that with their taxes. So you want the sellers to call you and say, hey, I got a tax bill. And maybe they're the kind of personality that wants to pay everything immediately after they get it. So they're like, I just want to write the check. You say, okay, when is it due? And they say, oh, it's not due for 3 months. Let's hold on to that. It's going to get prorated at closing. Don't worry about it. And if it's something where, you know, your services are going to be cut off the day before closing, if you don't pay it, then yes, you want them to pay. And just warn them, if they're paying a bill, it might get stuck in the middle and you end up paying it again at closing. So anyway, that's why we have the reminder on the checklist, just to not have that happen. But once in a while, you'll have someone have to double pay. So let's say back in the day, people would write checks to their community owners association instead of, maybe there's a credit card now. So that might be caught and they say, well, why am I paying for 3 months ago? It's like, well, because you were late on the bill and then you just paid up, but it's only been 2 days, that sort of thing. And then commission, obviously something was going on here. So real estate tax. Oh, this is a credit. Okay, this is what's going on. So real estate tax, you always want to tell your seller or your buyer, sorry, this is a buyer statement. You want to tell your buyer that we pay taxes in arrears in La Plata County. So next year, you're going to get, you're closing today, Mr. Buyer, and next year, you're going to get a tax bill for the entire year, even though you didn't live there the whole year. So they prorate it now the best they can based on this year's taxes, right? So you get it, you're getting a check right now. It's going into your, you're going to have to bring less to closing, but next year you're just going to have to pay it. And if the taxes happen to go up next year, it is what it is, and you just have to pay it. And I always rolled my eyes and I'd say, because taxes never seem to go down. And so it is what it is, and you just have to pay it. So then they remember in their head, oh, okay, so I'm getting money, but I have to pay it next year. So the only other thing on taxes, so do I go and calculate this? I do go into iTax or GIS, whatever, go onto the assessor site and say, it looks like the taxes are about $1,500. We're about halfway through the year. Not now, but I'm saying if I was halfway through the year, I'd say that looks like about halfway through the year taxes, looks good. I've never seen a problem on them, and I know it's all automatically calculated. I just want to make sure that the human on the other side has calculated it, and not, let's say you're selling a new property out of a larger parcel. So the big parcel, you're buying 5 acres of it. I just want to make sure it was prorated correctly and they're not tying it to the wrong property. So maybe I'm just being extra careful, but I just don't want to see a mistake. So then there was a credit from, so it looks like the agent credited back the buyer probably for some work that needed to be done. And then there was a credit from an agent at Coldwell Banker on our side. That all went to the buyer to probably make something happen and make them close. And then the seller credited the buyer for carpet, radon, blah, blah, blah. So how would you know about this thing? These things, they'd be in your amendment. So what I used to do is I hated going back through all my CTME files. Well, it used to be paper, but then it turned into CTME where before closing, or not before closing, but during the contract period, I hated going back to every amendment and saying, well, how did I word that? I would just make a handwritten note. It's like one sentence, and I'd put it in my hard copy file. This is my process. Have a different process for yourself, whatever works. And I'd paper clip it in there, or I'd staple it in there, and it would have all my notes like, don't forget at closing, there's a $2,000 carpet credit, because you're not going to remember, or you're going to have to just go through all your files and look for it. So that's where I'd have my notes. So I'd look for it and then I'd check it. And yes, I was at the closing table once, way longer into real estate than I should have been. I was probably had my license for 10 years. And I'm sitting there and my buyer happens to say, well, we were supposed to get a $2,000 credit. And my face was like, oh my God, how did I miss that? It was one of those we're having around the office today, or this, like this whole summer and this going into fall. It's so busy. And when you are busy and you have 8 different under contracts and you have this one seller that won't leave you alone, the phone won't stop ringing, and you got to check the settlement statement and you got to do an amendment and you need to write the little note in the file. Have a system. When you're a newer agent, create something that works so that you will have less balls dropped. So it happens to everyone that you get busy and you're going to make a mistake. Things happen, but thank God for my buyer that they remembered that, because what would have happened if they had made that phone call to me the next day? Seller wasn't in the state. Yeah, they were supposed to prorate it. What if from the goodness of their heart, they didn't want to give them $2,000 after closing? So I got really lucky that my buyer thought of it. We stopped the press. The buyer sat there. They had to redo all the closing paperwork. Thank God it was a cash closing, so we didn't have to go and give it to the lender again. But just know, everybody does it. Find a system that works, and know that you cannot forget about like credits and window washing fees or any of these things that you decided during the contract period. And if it is just going back through your contracts, that's fine too. Check the final price. Yep, got that. So that's pretty much it. So then when you're looking at it, you're just showing your buyer, this whole thing might take 10 minutes on the phone or less. It could take 5 minutes on the phone. You say, hey, I'd just love to meet with you for 5 minutes. We just got the settlement statement. I checked it. Everything looks good to me. You're not saying it's perfect. You're saying it looks good to me, because it's always your fault, right? It's always your fault if there's a mistake. So can we just go over it real quick? Would you like to? And I never had anybody fight that. It always was really great to just get it up on the screen and ask if they had any questions. And again, it just saves you time at closing. So let's go on to the next one. And keep your settlement statements, because it helps you when someone says, well, how much does that usually cost? You can think, I had a closing with so-and-so and it was about this much. Let me go look for that. It helps. So this one was over in Mancos. Woo, that's big. There we go. It's a little smaller. Okay, this is downtown Mancos, but this one did have a loan on it, okay? So loan amount, sales price, this is a different company, this is CTS, and there's 3 different companies in town, obviously, and you're probably gonna deal with all 3 of them. They all have their settlement statements look a little bit different. So over here, I just wanted to show you, sometimes you get lender credits. So a lender will take out, it's the same as this, they take out money for your escrow. So when you get a loan, anybody who's owned a home, they at closing have to take a bunch of taxes to put in an escrow account. They take a bunch of, not taxes, but tax money from you to pay your taxes the following year. They take money from you to pay for sometimes your first year of not HOA, but homeowners insurance. And they might take an additional 6 months, and then they prepay some HOAs, and some things are kept in an escrow account. But then there's this calculation, maybe it's a state law, maybe it's their law, that says you can't keep more than a certain percentage of a person's escrow. I don't know. So they like take all this money from you on the settlement statement, and they give you a little bit back. So there's all sorts of weird stuff when you have a lender, and really it's best anytime they have a lender question, I just say, let's call so-and-so. I have you call so-and-so and let me know if you have any questions. And it's best, again, to do that before you get to the closing table. So there was some sort of lender credit here. There was a deposit. This is the earnest money, so they call it a deposit on theirs. Sales price of the property, county taxes, that's normal. And so really, when you're checking this, you're like, oh, 1/1 to 10/8, yep, that's the closing date. At about this a year, and then you look up in iTax, it takes you 3 minutes to check what the taxes are for the year. So loan amount, yep, that was it. And if this is wildly different than what the buyer told you they were getting for a loan, then just ask them, say, hey, it says 170. I thought you were getting a loan for like 200. And they go, oh no, we decided to bring more cash to closing. That's cool. So for here, it's an appraisal fee. I have seen appraisals that, okay, this is $550. I've seen, it's the same with ILCs. Sometimes you're paying for improvement location certificates at closing. I've seen appraisal fees be anywhere up to like, I don't know, over $1,000 for sure. So this can be wildly different from place to place. Just be aware. Credit report, they always have to pull a credit report. That's normal. Lender's inspection fee. See, I don't even know what these are. A lender's inspection fee. It's probably, maybe it was a specific kind of loan. Underwriting fee. These are all different for every place. So if the buyer, here's one I can answer. If the buyer said, what's a tax service? That's for a company to be watching the taxes and making sure your escrows are correct after closing. Flood certification, so $12. Let's say this house was on top of the La Plata Mountains and there's no water within like 10 miles. They still have to see if it's in a flood zone. So I always make a joke about that and say there's always something they have to certify, and one of them is a flood zone. Prepaid interest. So this is cool. If people get upset that, oh my gosh, $400 all up front for interest, just say, but it's going to be a long, long time before you have to pay that first. Because you're prepaying your interest, you're not going to have to pay your first bill for a while. And the lender always knows when that is. So see here how they had a do a homeowner's insurance premium for the 12 months, and then they have to do 3 extra months of reserves. So you're prepaying a whole year. So if the lender, if you're not paying your bills, the lender at least knows they've had that paid for, and then they do an additional 3 months, and then they escrow an additional 7 months of your taxes. And here's that adjustment I'm telling you about. So we're going to take your money, we're going to take your money, and then we're going to take your money, and then we're going to give you a little bit back. This title charge, again, that's just to cover the lender's title insurance, not the whole thing. And these whole things, all these are all endorsements. And we'll talk about that when we take a title class. So endorsements are all the things on top of just regular title insurance that it's kind of like with homeowners. They'll say, here's your homeowner's insurance, but we need this, you need extra coverage because you have really expensive paintings in your house, or you have jewelry or furs, is how it says on my State Farm thing. It says extra endorsement for jewelry and furs. It's the same thing for title insurance, that you have all these extra endorsements that the lender is requiring. So all of these things, if they cost you money, you guys can see my cursor, right? When I'm like moving it around. Yeah. Okay. So those are all, and it was only a $20 fee for all of them. And then survey endorsement. So owner's survey coverage. So another $34. So just say, these are all lender fees. It's pretty normal to have these. That's how I say it. It's pretty normal to have these so they don't get upset at their lender. And then title costs. Okay. So on closing fees, this is what's confusing when you're new. You agreed on the closing, on the contract to pay for half of the closing fee, remember? So usually it's half buyer, half seller. That's a, what, $400 fee or $375, $350. That's the one that's split, but the buyer always pays for the cost of their loan. Just like you're paying for the cost of the appraisal, the buyer would pay for the cost of their loan being closed. So there's a closing fee for the property, there's a closing fee for the loan, and sometimes there's some extra fee for, like, if you're buying a for sale by owner, the seller has to pay, things like that too. So that's what, if you see that title fee and you go, oh my gosh, $400, what's that from? That's what it is. And then again, this stuff doesn't change. It's the recording and transfer fees. Any questions on those two so far? Just break in. There's number 3. Okay, now we're going on the seller side. Oh, and if somebody, yeah, just break in if you have questions.
Wait, I do have a question. So
Yeah,
on the settlement sheet that I just did, we didn't have any mechanics lien on there. Is it kind of a, you know, it can be there, it can not?
Oh, for a fee to check them?
Yeah.
Yeah, so a mechanics lien, that has to do with, on your title coverage, there's exceptions. And the first 7 or 8 of them are on every single title commitment that comes out. It's like, encroachments or taxes that haven't been paid or things like that. And one of them is this checking for mechanics liens. So it's checking between the time of contract and closing. It's like that little period, or maybe that's different. Anyway, mechanics liens is one of them. So you can purchase extra insurance to make sure there's no mechanics liens. And yes, there should be a coverage, but it might've been that you're on the seller side. No, you're on the buyer side. Huh. You would think that they must have had something in the contract where the other party paid for it. Was it not on either settlement statement?
I never received the seller side settlement statement.
Yeah. So it might have been on the seller side. So do check the seller side, and here's why. Make sure you're being paid right. So it is so hard to collect your commission after closing. If you have a contract, or let's say the seller had a listing contract with their buyer's agent or their listing agent, and it said that you were going to get paid 3%. They put it in the MLS as 3%. On my checklist that I put, the under contract checklist, I say you always print or take a screenshot of what the MLS sheet says the day you go under contract, okay? Because it happens that at the same time as you happen to be negotiating this loan or this contract, that the seller is talking to their listing agent and saying, gosh, I'm not getting any showings. Okay, not in this market, but let's say it's a bad market. And they're like, I'm not getting any showings. Do I need to reduce the price? And the listing agent goes, you got to reduce it 20 grand or we're never going to get this under contract. They go, okay, but only if you reduce the commission on that, the agent, to be something. So then you show the property. it reduces in price and you don't notice that it reduced to the 2.5% somewhere in there. And now you're getting paid less and you need to like figure out, well, you said it was 3%. I swear it said 3%. Just take a screenshot the day you go under contract where it says the other, what they're offering as a commission, and you will save so much headache. But the other way to save headache is to look at the seller statement. You never ever send the seller side statement to the buyer. It's none of the buyer's business how much the seller is getting paid, because that's the way to, I don't know if anybody else would say differently, but I feel like the seller says when you're negotiating, oh, I'm losing my shirt on this transaction. Like, no, I can't come down anymore. And then if your buyer saw their statement where they're walking away with 200 grand, they'd be like, oh my God, they're such liars. Like, it's a bad taste in their mouth. I don't know. Maybe if you're a seller's agent, a buyer's agent, you should be sharing that. But I feel like it's got their information on it. It's none of their business. But I want to check it to make sure that my payment is right, that that's actually 3%. Sometimes it doesn't say 3% on it if you're supposed to be paid 3%. It'll just have an amount. You have to get out your calculator and make sure that's 3%. So here's what happened in our office last year. I'm totally off the subject, but we had a Mancus agent who didn't check. And I mean, you just assume you're going to get paid, right? And it said it just like this: real estate commission to Coldwell Banker, and it had an amount. And then she gets it and we calculate it and it wasn't right. And she doesn't realize it till we cut the check. She's like, gosh, that doesn't seem right. And it was a lot less than she was supposed to get paid. So it was one of these discount brokerages in Denver. And I had to, like, how many certified letters did I have to send them saying we were going to take this to court where they paid us. They owe us $2,500. Oh my God, it took months to get our money. So just check. It's really easy to check. So here's a seller. This is a complicated property. I don't know why I did this one first, but it's probably, did I say cash? It was probably a cash one. Oh no, it was seller. Seller's always easier anyway. And I guess this doesn't show all that well. But seller concession, so you're looking at how much they're actually supposed to be making. So this was the sales price of the property. There was some sort of concession they were doing. And then they have to, is this seller or buyer? Did I say that? No, it's seller. Oh yeah, they're being credited for county taxes. I don't know how that worked. But anyway, they're paying the commission out of it. Just make sure the commission's right. They're paying for the entire title commitment, the one that ensures the title is good to the buyer. And then they pay for the OEC if you're doing it. So yeah, the mechanics lien cover endorsement. So that's on the seller side. So that would be it, Anna. You were on the buyer side of that one. So it would have shown on the seller side. That's an endorsement just that costs that much. Or it's not an endorsement. I should be careful of my language. It's an owner's extended coverage. It's protecting the buyer. It's giving them a higher form of title commitment. That's what I always told people, or a higher form of knowing you have good title. The settlement or closing fee that was split is $200 because that was a $400 closing because it was split. Document copies. So this is kind of silly to me. It used to be that you went to a Xerox copier and you got a package of exceptions. So imagine every single document that comes with, get a title commitment. And you know how there's all those links? And it links to Forest Lakes, all their covenants. And then there's like 6 different court cases and more links to easements and more links to, that used to all come in a big package. So you get this thing up in your mailbox and you, like Deb or whoever worked up there would try to shove it in your box. And then you'd have to get that to the buyer. You'd have to overnight it to the buyer. People were always FedExing from the office. Well, so they used to actually charge you $50 to do that. It's a Xerox cost, but they still seem to charge you $50, even though it's all online now. And then title, express delivery tracking fee. Okay, $75 here. Sometimes there's a fee for, I guess I used to see it, maybe they don't do it anymore, where it's a courier fee. So you know the courier, that there is a courier that walks back and forth from, I guess, now that land title has moved, it would only be CTS, but they come and pick up earnest money checks. They come and deliver packages to us. So you're paying for that charge on the settlement statement. And then the HOA transfer fee. So TACO is the one up at Tamaron, and I don't know what it stands for. I can't remember, but it's $150 to transfer. Know that some of these transfer fees are expensive. Like the one on, there's some irrigation on the Mesa, Florida Conservancy District. One of them, it's $750, or it used to be. I think it's even might be more expensive now to transfer into somebody else's name. So don't assume that they're always really cheap fees. Prorated, do I go and call the taco and make sure that's the right transfer fee? No, that's not something I have to worry about. And then prorated fourth quarter HOA dues. Now, if I had a really complicated property, so if you're dealing with something up at Purg that's in Purgatory Lodge, that is the one. I will tell you, if you're dealing with Purgatory Lodge properties, there is a lady over at Colorado Title Services, Tracy, that did like 99% of the closings for any property there because it was super complicated. And you never want a newer closer doing a really complicated deal where you're dealing with like multiple HOAs and then they have this fee and that fee because if they call the wrong person and they don't get it on the settlement statement. So that's the only property I can think of where I really always had everyone that I knew up north would always go to a specific closer who would be better at that. But I've seen a lot of problems on settlement statements before that have been because of closers just not understanding things. I had one where they kept adding the wrong property to title, and so even though we got it fixed, so I have a seller with a house in Forest Lakes and he's got a lot in Forest Lakes, but he's only selling a house, and we had a title commitment that included both properties. So then we fixed it. And still on the settlement statement included the taxes for both properties that were prorated. It's like, oh my God, how many times do I have to tell you that we're only selling one property here? So you do have to not assume that just because you're new, you shouldn't assume that you don't know what you're doing. If you see something that's a red flag, just call on it. So here's the last one. See, I started using whiteout here. It actually worked. Contract sales price. This one is just up in town. Contract sales price is there. Window washing. See, there's always fees. If you want to make sure you have closers, they used to call me and say, is there anything that needs to be paid out of closing? If you have random bills that your seller hasn't paid you for or your buyer hasn't paid you for, get it put on there. Even if they said, oh, I'll get you paid back for that. You put it on there because you might not be paid otherwise. So I had no problem paying for my seller or buyer, mostly sellers because buyers, if they bail on the contract, you might never get paid. But if it was a seller side, I'd be like, I'd go and get this ordered and I'd get this ordered. So if you've gone ahead and I have one property I'll never forget. So like, let's say it's a foreclosure and you have a water tester go up there and you have a person to turn on the utilities and then you had a propane bill because they had to put propane in the tank and bring a propane there. You better write down on that little piece of paper all those different fees or not fees, but all the different bills that are going to have to be paid, and you get those paid out of closing, because if you don't, then you're going to get the call months later where I did, where it's like, I never got paid for that $800 worth of work for your buyer. And I like, they said they paid you, and just call the contractors themselves. So like, let's say it's a Beeman Brothers or whatever, and your buyer says, oh yeah, I'll get that paid. Or they even said, oh yeah, my wife paid that. Just call Beeman and said, did you get a payment for that yet? I'm just checking. I didn't want to bother my buyer with it, but I wanted to see if you got that. And if not, it is the best way to make friends with contractors by just making sure they get paid, because it's a small town and you don't want somebody who doesn't want to work with you because so-and-so buyer, or feel like obligated yourself to pay for it because your buyer didn't pay for it. So anyway, that's the window washing fee. And the closers have no problem putting things on the settlement statement if you say that it has to go. Earnest money retained by Colorado. So that's the 5,000. They just put it over here. See how it's not on here? They just do it differently. HOA dues, county taxes. Let's see if there's any. Okay, this one had, I think I added this one. Sometimes there are two mortgages. So there's the first, right? And then rates dropped a lot and they wanted to get a second mortgage out, or maybe rates went up then. So they got a little loan instead of refinancing the whole thing. People do that a lot where they take out some equity to buy a car or do something else. And then commissions. So the payoffs have to happen at closing. Commissions, title, let's see if there's anything funny here. Express delivery, document copies, and they're $500 or $50. Release handling fee. Okay, this one, $90. That is to release the loan. So it's for Colorado Land or Title Services to release that loan. And you can also see here, so there's a process they have to do to make sure the loan is paid off correctly. So here's another one. This person was behind on their water and sewer bills. Their water was about to be shut off. So your buyer doesn't have to go and give their name to City of Durango because the closing company did that for them. But here's the charges they were charged. So if your seller went and paid these 3 bills the week before and it shows up on the That's why you just want them to communicate. Hey, I'm really behind on this bill. Did you get a disconnect notice? No, you're probably good. Do you want to just delay and see if we can get it paid at closing? Maybe call City of Durango and tell them when it's going to be paid to make sure you're not going to be cut off. Have them just communicate with you. Sellers love that if you're just being careful. So I don't think I have to share for the rest of this and some other notes. Things to be aware of. If your buyer needs to wire funds for a closing, I think it's almost all wires now, isn't it? It used to be you could write a check and bring it down like a certified check, and I don't even know if they're doing that anymore. So a wired funds, if you hear someone, now that you guys are getting paid ACH for your closings, you're going to remember that word ACH. It used to be that I was like, what's the ACH? So I'd have this buyer that be like, oh yeah, I'll get the money. I'm going to ACH it this afternoon. I'd be like, wait, what's that ACH thing? That's not a wire. ACH is not a wire. It's kind of like when you're transferring from account to account. It's not the same thing to a bank, and closing companies do not take them. Okay. So remember that you have to tell your buyer that it has to be an actual wire, not an ACH. So I've gotten in that pickle before. So unless something's changed, know that that's the way it is. Please interrupt me if you know that that's not correct. That's just how it was at least 3 years ago when I was selling. Morgan Stanley. The Morgan Stanley people, you have, I had $1 million, they were $1 million buyers. They happened to buy a lot instead. So it wasn't $1 million sale for me, but they had like 6 houses and, they had very complicated finances, but their money was coming out of Morgan Stanley. Morgan Stanley makes you physically or used to go to Morgan Stanley to write what you needed and hand it to someone, and they're only open at a certain time, and you had to go to this place. And my people were in Arizona, but their Morgan Stanley office was somewhere else. It can be complicated for people to get the money to closing. So if you have a buyer of any means, you talk to them. How is your money going to get to closing? What is that process? And you never want them to assume that it's going to show up at the title company the next day. It just doesn't happen. So they have to start working on it a few days before. At least call the rep or whoever it is they're working with a good week before and say, how long does the process take to get to Colorado? I'd love it to arrive the day before. Why? We're a tabletop closing state in Colorado. That means your money has to be at the closing table or you have defaulted. So if your money arrives at the title company before the end of the day, you're good. But if it arrives the next day, there's a certain clause you put into the contract. If you're even a little bit worried about it, if you have scatterbrained people or something, put this clause into it. And it says if your funds arrive up till 2 o'clock the next day, that you're good. So in a normal market, it might not matter. If you're in a bad market, just a regular mediocre market, the seller's not going to turn you away because you didn't get the funds in time. They're going to I want the money, so I'm willing to wait 24 hours. But in this market, when you have a backup offer and that backup offers for even more than you were paying, and they've been mad about it the whole time you're under contract, believe me, they might just take your earnest money and say, well, they defaulted. So just be really careful. We've had some deals that were saved with that little clause in there. And no, tabletop closing state. If you're dealing with an out-of-state lender or an out-of-state person, a big company that's not local and in town and gets it, they might think they don't realize what the Colorado laws are, and this is their response to it is what's the big deal? I'm going to get the money tomorrow. So you just have to make sure it's there on time. It's always your problem. If it's
how do you get a buyer to share that information with you if you've asked and you tried asking in different ways and they're not wanting to tell you where their money's from?
Oh, that's a huge red flag that they're not going to get their money, because I worry about people like that too. That is the money coming from another source? Is it your parents? Does this have to be contingent on something happening? That's the whole. So when you're going over the contract, that's a great question. And I would say it starts with going over the contract with them. That little box you check that says the buyer does or does not have the funds immediately available. So this is the way I say it. I say, do you or do you not right now, sitting in your bank account, have the amount of money that it says right here, the $150,000 sitting there and waiting to transfer? They say no. I say, what has to happen before that happens? And then when they do that, I can now ask the question, what needs to happen before that? Because I need to know how to write this offer. So if they say, oh, well, actually, my mom's giving me all the money. Well, it's kind of should have your mom on the contract if she's giving you the money, right? Or at least the seller would be aware that it's there's a scary thing that has to happen beforehand. Maybe not scary, but they might not feel so warm and fuzzy about your offer than they did if you say, yes, the money's sitting there, right?
Yeah.
And that also means it could be tied to the stock market. So with the market doing what it did earlier this year, the seller would want to know, is it tied to the stock market? The stock market tanks. And now you say, oh, it was a cash offer, but I don't have the money right now. So,
So, Heather, in
go
that
ahead.
case, you would have to check does not, right?
Yep.
Because they wouldn't have it. And then I don't think there's a place to write it in. Is that just a conversation then you have with the other agent possibly?
Yeah, if they're
What's
smart
the-
enough to notice that, then they would say, so what has to happen? And I say, okay, how do you want to explain this to the other agent? So I've already counseled with my buyer. Okay, what do you want me to tell the person? We have to tell them where this money is coming from, and that it's contingent on you getting the money. It's not up to you anymore. It's up to somebody else. So, or it's up to the Morgan Stanley or something. But if it's not contingent, if you're not making it contingent on getting that money, then your earnest money is at risk. So really it's up to the buyer. If they don't want to make it contingent on them getting money from mom and dad, then if they don't get it, they're kind of like, that's not a reason.
They're the ones kind of at risk because they lose. I
Totally.
mean, the seller's not going to like it if they get 3 weeks into the contract and find out they didn't have it, but your buyer
Yeah, totally at risk.
is at
So
risk.
yeah, so I would say, Anna, if you have that conversation up front, then you probably won't get into that not being able to talk to them about it. Does that make sense? I think that's probably how I would handle it. So how quick a turnaround for paperwork? This is a good one to talk about since we're talking about closings. Your buyer needs an address. They need it. And post-COVID, you guys might know this better than me. So like Adrian, if I'm saying anything that you don't think is correct, just correct me. But the way it was is that someone has a mail out, and if it's not cash, you need hard signatures on everything, or you used to. I guess we don't need it on everything now, but you needed an address. You can't get this just delivered to a post office box. So a work address is fine, and that's what most people did, is just send it to my work because there's tons of people there and they can hand it to me, right? But know that it's a really quick turnaround. That is probably the biggest thing I forgot to tell my buyers or sellers, that you're waiting and waiting and waiting, especially on the seller side. You're waiting and waiting and waiting for this deal to know whether it's going to close. And then all of a sudden you got to like rush around and get the paperwork and go to the notary and get it signed and get it back in the mail. It's all got to happen in a few hours, right? It's like really fast. So the most you're going to have is maybe 24 hours to get it back in the mail. So if I don't prepare my people for it, they are super annoyed. They're like, I hate the title company. It's not fair. I'm like, so if you just tell them ahead of time, look, this is all going to happen really fast. Just make sure you're in town. And if they're not, it's no big deal. You can get it sent to a hotel. If they're traveling, just make them aware way ahead of time. I just need to know, is it the campground? Where are you going to be? Tell me where it's going to be. I need an actual physical mailing. You're going to have to get it notarized, so call in advance, find out. Some people don't have a notary, no big deal. Banks do it. A Coldwell Banker office in another state is going to do it. Any of these people, if they have a notary, mailboxes, etc., has notaries, or they used to. Post-COVID, everything's changing, but there's notaries everywhere, right? So just have them not scrambling saying, I have no idea how to find a notary and get this done. Now that we have e-cigs, I bet a lot of it's easier. And with cash, oh my God, it's so easy. And also know with storms, you can have blizzards where people are freaking out because it's 4 o'clock and the paperwork hasn't come in and we're just assuming we're not going to close today. So that does happen where the highway down to Albuquerque is closed. Know that that's true. And another trick I've used is if I have a buyer who I know needs a couple of days to look at that, or maybe they have to go to the Morgan Stanley, or they really just, it would make my life easier because this person's a big pain in the butt, that if they got their settlement statements a couple of days, you can't pull this favor all the time. But if you once in a while tell that closer, who is literally, my closer was working till 8:30 at night, I'd get emails from her. I'm like, you're still, and I'd call her, I'm like, you're still in the office. She's like, I just have 2 more to do. I just got to get this done. But if you pull once, you can understand it. Getting off the subject. You have a closer that's that busy. When are they going to start doing your settlement statements? The day before closing, right? Or like the day before they have to get them in the mail. They don't have time to do anything and they're scrambling and they're trying to figure out. They're not looking 3 days in advance to say, who can I make life happy right now? But if you have a tough person, or it would just one day, or it's your favorite client and you really want to make sure everything's smooth for them, then call that person and say, look, even tell them it 2 weeks before closing, 3 weeks before closing, I'm going to call you about a week and a half before closing, and I'm letting you know this is a very difficult person. and I really, or they're an engineer and they pick everything apart and they're going to be miserable a few days before closing unless we get that settlement statement a couple of days. Is there any way, we're closing on Friday, is there any way I can get that on Monday? I'm really sorry to do that. Or say they're leaving town and they need to do the wire a full week early. Make something up, do something, but don't say the day of, I need that settlement statement today. Just prepare them that that's it. And if you don't do it all the time, then they'll know they won't realize you're lying, right? But I've done that. Propane, how do you deal with propane? Anybody do the photo yet? You go out to the property and you pull up the tank reader and you take a photo of it. And let's say you did that a week and a half before closing and it's the middle of summer and you know nobody's using it except to heat their hot water. If it says 47%, it's probably going to be at 46%. So you just decide between everybody, say, hey, it says 47. Why don't we prorate it at 45%? Is that cool? But you have a photo, right? It used to be I just write it down, but now you can do a photo. If it's like in the winter, just judge. It's a $1,000-gallon tank. I took a picture of it. We're not closing for a week. It says 47%. How about we just call it good at 43%? That's a lot of propane you're going to be going through between the next week. Just make sure everybody's kosher with it and make sure it ends up on the, don't forget to do that. Because I have been in the winter running out to Forest Lakes because Denise Storm or whoever it was Denise Storm, I think, that, oh, I forgot to take that on my way to town this morning. I'm like, oh my God. And the settlement statement has to go out by 2 o'clock. So I jump in my car. This is what life is when you're new agent. Drove out there just to get a photo and she lived right in the neighborhood. It might not have been her, but I'm pretty sure it was. Where it's like, just take a photo. Like you have 1 month to take that photo and you didn't do it. So yeah, take the photo way before. If you're doing the walkthrough, don't just write it on your hand. Take the photo of the propane. Make sure it's on there because you'll end up paying for it if it's not on the settlement statement.
So Heather, I have a question because the home that we closed on today is my first closing where it's had propane. And I didn't know anything about that.
So you didn't have, it's on the checklist. That's why I put it on the checklist so you won't forget. So
well, I missed doing that. So, but it was on the settlement statement and I noticed it, but
the other agent did it.
So Gina did it for me and didn't tell me.
She just totally did it.
Okay.
See? And most people are good like that. They say, hey, did you get the propane reading yet? I'm going up to do the walkthrough. Do you mind if I take it? Because it's a vacant property. And you're like, thank you.
One of the two agents is always,
it doesn't matter.
That's who's doing. Okay. I just was curious who. I'm like, well, who did it? So Gina did it. Okay.
And so the only thing that's not in the contract that you actually have to write in for prorations is the propane tank rental. No, propane's in there. So you don't have to worry. That will be prorated. You just have to figure it out. But most of the time the people don't own the tank. It's rented. And it's like, I don't know, my tank is like $150 a year. It's no big deal.
Yeah, I think theirs is like 15 for the month.
Yeah. So you just prorate it at closing. I mean, what's the big deal? If you make one little mistake on a closing or a settlement statement, write a check. No big deal. Be done with it. But I just wanted my mistakes to be a minimum because I was always writing a check. So I'd rather not write a big check. I'd rather have it a closing gift than like a check I needed for propane. They're gonna be like, oh, that's the girl that paid for my propane at closing. Like, thank you. No bottle of champagne or anything. Rentals. Make a note if it's a rental on how you're going to handle that. A lot of that's dealt with outside of the contract. If it's a yearly rental, like what I did when I bought a rental from Daniel in the office, is he just gave me the lease and I wrote a new lease with that person. That's all handled outside of closing. And so security deposits, though, that had to be transferred, right? So the person, if they're staying, security deposits, and you'll just know because you're writing up the contract. So all this stuff is in the contract. You can have a security deposit. You're going to have the last month's rent if you had that in the lease. So just make notes. And then if it's more complicated because, duplexes, things like that, triplexes, those are a pain in the butt to do because it's all sorts of security deposits. And that's when you get into having a statement. When it's a more complicated property, you're in a different contract. So you have that whole, what's it called? There's that date that you have to give a person, the buyer, an estoppel statement. And that's what it means. Estoppel statement means unit 1 is $770 a month. They paid first month's rent. They are not behind on their rent. So that's where you get all that information and you can just print it out and have it. But it gets more complicated when you get into vacation rentals. You have people who have prepaid, so they Airbnb, they're paying you in advance, and they're not there yet, or maybe they're on day 2 and they're staying for 14 days. So it's really, really helpful when your buyer is taking over the Airbnb from the same property management company. It's a clean split. They just deal with the security deposits, all the deposits just go to the next person, and it can all be on the settlement statement if you want. It's all super easy. So I always encourage, the way I would get out of it being a mess is to just say, look, you've never had a vacation rental before. How about you go and do your research with all these other companies, but why not just stick with a property management company that has it right now for the first year? And then after closing, you can figure out whether you want it to be moved. It just makes sense, right? Because then otherwise you're also trying to decide on if you're switching companies and the old property management company made the rentals that aren't happening for another 6 months, they still can get paid on those. So it's like, oh my God, just don't do it before closing. But usually that stuff's handled pretty much outside of closing. And then closers to keep close to you. Just have somebody you like working with. And it's going to take a while. You start working with different people. You're like, they were really mean, or I didn't like how they handled it. I picked someone, I always like people around me. Carrie, the new person in our office, Carrie, she's like the warm and fuzzy that I like to have around me in business. I like to have my closer and the lender that my buyers work with, everybody just being really nice, and because it's so stressful to have a buyer close, and you just want somebody that can go and almost hold their hand in the conversation, like, now, did you see that this settlement statement? You're like, oh my gosh, you're so sweet. How can somebody be upset when you're talking to them on the phone? Now, they might hang up the phone and be like, rah, 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 but at least I know they're going to have it. So find that warm and fuzzy person, or if you're like, I like a direct person, I like this, find someone that your personality works well with and make them your go-to whenever you can get a closing to them. I mean, obviously it's your seller's choice, but if the other agent is new and they say, like, let's say 10 years from now, 5 years from now, you have a brand new agent on the other end, and they go, well, who would you use? To give them your closer and give them lots of business. And that's how you have people able to pull favors for you. Oh my gosh, I almost, that was it, but two minutes over. You guys have any questions? Okay.